do a real quick introduction of tonight's guest who's joining us from, it was back east, right? Somewhere back east, you said?
Yes, North
Okay.
Carolina.
Oh, great, great. So it's getting late your time, so I'll turn it over to hear you in a second, Matt. But David was trained as a pharmaceutical scientist as his job to find connections that people usually would not identify in the world and the use of medications and the development of avoidable health events. Turned out that his work experience was a perfect platform to launch the type of photography in which he is now engaged. His photographic journey began in 1990s, capturing local scenery, historical landmarks around his home in Fairfield, Connecticut, drawn early on to ethereal imagery evocative of dream state. He also explored infrared photography, something I can identify with, and darkroom manipulations to create surreal, otherworldly visuals. His C3 approach has led to the publication of 3 books, numerous awards, participation in juried exhibitions, and sales to collectors throughout the world. And I'm sure there's plenty more that he's done, but that's what I was able to pull off of his website. So looking forward to tonight's presentation. I don't know if you heard when we first did the introduction or the opening comments, I mentioned that in about, I guess, 6 or 7 weeks, we have our image competition, and it's a themed competition, and it's on intentional camera movement. So
That's
we're
great.
all looking forward to learning tonight how to go about what we should do for that
Great.
competition.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, hi, everybody. I'm glad to be with you tonight. I used to come out to Denver quite frequently when I was working. And when we were skiing in our younger years, we would ski at Winter Park. It was really great. I broke my hand there. I developed a pneumothorax there and ended up in the hospital. My wife broke a leg there, but good memories. Other than that, but yeah, no, it's Denver's a great town. It's a very, very beautiful place. But anyhow, I'm going to talk with you this evening about what I call controlled camera chaos, and it's a new way to create abstract art using intentional camera movement photography. And by way of full disclosure, this presentation isn't about the Blue Ridge Mountains, isn't about bucolic scenery or cute fuzzy animals or street scenes or beautiful people. I bring that up every presentation I do because sometimes people think that since I'm from the Blue Ridge Mountains, those are automatically the types of things that I'm going to photograph, show them pictures of our mountains and the cute fuzzy animals. And I don't think you guys would want to see that because you've got more interesting animals out there than we do here, and your mountains are much better than ours too. So I guess it's not a problem here. But anyhow, this is what I do right here. I call this landscape in orange, and I'll show you a little bit later how I made that. If you look very, very closely on there, you can see there's some newsprint down in there, and I'll show you how I incorporate that into these images that I make. And I do things like this. I call this Blue Man Group. This is a composited triptych that I made a couple months back, and that's the pretty representative of some of the things that I do. But let's back up for a minute. Let's talk about more traditional ICM. What ICM stands for is intentional camera movement, and it's in just that movement of the camera during a longer than normal exposure time to create a sense of motion and mystery to a photographic image. The subject matter is usually the same as that of that you were just mentioning here on your upcoming meetings, birds, animals, landscapes, and so on and so forth. And it's the subject matter just varies depending on who the ICM photographer is that we're talking about. Uh, this photograph right here is a picture of the pier at a place called Holden Beach. The reason why there's a little bit of clouds there that are moving out is because that is the day after Hurricane Ian hit. And that pier was closed as a consequence of that hurricane. Actually, the outer third of that pier broke away, and it's been closed ever since. So I'm glad to get a photograph of that. But anyhow, it's camera movement along with creative lighting and scene manipulation is what my photography is all about, and we'll talk about that at great length this evening. Now, how does C3 differ from traditional ICM? Well, a successful ICM image relies upon your camera settings and your movement along with post-processing to produce a final image. The settings are longer than normal exposures. In the studio, I'll typically expose for anywhere from 2 to 5 seconds. And outside, people will do a lot of ICM photography. Excuse me. It's very, very hard for them to get the movement of the camera the way they want. And one of the things that people do is they forget that when you go out into a brightly lit environment, you have a big problem with lighting at these slower shutter speeds. So as a consequence of that, a lot of people will try to move the camera very, very quickly. So one of the things, I don't think I've got it in this presentation tonight, but you might want to consider if you're going to do ICM outside, is to get yourself a good nine-stop neutral density filter. That way you can slow your camera shutter speed way down without having a lot of highlight blowouts from an outdoor photograph. But inside, the C3 that I do is a dance between the camera movement, light manipulation, and modification of the scene, along with post-processing to produce a final image. And whenever I'm producing these images, I would say I probably spend more time arranging my scenes and manipulating my light than I actually do shooting the scenes. And that's why I call it a dance, because I'll shoot a scene, move something a couple of millimeters, shoot it again until I get finally to a place I want. And sometimes that can take several hours to get to exactly where I want. And here's a good example of that. This is one that I call Sonogram of the Universe. It's another triptych. This was one of my early experiments with taking artificial plant parts and real plant parts, sticks, leaves, twigs, newsprint. You can see some newsprint in here, and a couple of pieces of tissue paper, and freezing it in ice. And that's what gives me this blue, a really interesting texture background right here. And as a consequence of that, I'm able to create a texture as well as hold everything in place when it's all frozen in place to get what I want. Now, this image is a really interesting image because it didn't make a lot of sense to me when I first started doing it, because it didn't have much color in it. It didn't have much color contrast between the blues and the whites and this little bit of red right here, which was excuse me, which was a small berry from a plant out, from a shrub out in our yard. But what I did to create all this orange in here, to give you some idea how crazy this can get sometimes, that orange and some of these brown pieces that you see in here are a consequence of a raw egg that I dropped into this frozen concoction and then smeared around, and that gave me what I wanted. Now, a lot of people that look at this say, well, it's a struggle with a lot of the galleries that look at my work, and it's they say, well, you're producing something that's obviously AI driven here, but the reality is there's no AI involved in any of this. And this is another image called Oscillation. That's a triptych as well, and it was nothing but a ring light set in a couple pieces of plastic bags. Now, after going around with this with a few people about what AI was and what AI wasn't, I decided to ask Chatbot to go, no, it was the Microsoft Copilot, to go out, take a look at my images, and give me its rendition of what it saw on my web page. At first, it wouldn't do it because it said my images were copyrighted, but we got around that. I finally got it to do it. And here's what it came up with. And I think you can see the obvious differences in the AI version and the type of things that I do. Going back a slide here, it's not nearly as raw as one of my images are. They tend to be more finished and more precise. And I think it's easy to tell that that in fact is an AI image right there. So anyhow, the story is there's no AI involved in any of this. It's all a consequence of camera movement in my studio, which I'll show you in a minute. The artist's statement. What I'm doing is exploring the way dreams distort and rearrange the meaning of things. And what I really try to do is create these abrupt transitions between elements in my scene that make people think about them and think that maybe you've seen something like this somewhere, but you aren't sure where it came from, and maybe it came from just something that you dreamed up at some point in time. And I'll show how that relates into what I'm doing in a minute too. But the reality is, most of this, what I do is very simple scenes, materials and the lighting that provide the basis for these interesting abstract images. This image right here was nothing more than a stick from a bush, a piece of newsprint, and a crystal ball. And I put the camera right up against the crystal ball and then slowly moved it out like that over about a 2-second exposure. And this is what came out of it on the other end. Now, we live in really what I consider to be the golden age of ICM photography, and it's nothing new. ICM photography has been around since Ernst Haas started doing it routinely in 1956, and this is his image of the Luck of the Cape is what that translates to, that he took at a bullfight in Spain in 1956. But it wasn't until about 1990 that a guy named Michael Orton up in British Columbia uh, started to experiment with the digital camera. And the digital cameras really are what made this doable thing. Because if you stop and think about it, you're going to have a lot of throwaway images when you're moving the camera while you're taking the image, because there's a lot of variables that you have to take into consideration. Now, I'm doing about 360,000 exposures a year here, and I was curious to see what an impact the digital camera era had on the ICM photography. And if I were doing 360,000 exposures a year with my old Nikon F5, that would translate into 10,000 rolls of film, 35 millimeter film, $8 a roll if you can find it for that, plus $12 processing a roll. That would mean an annual film cost of about $200,000. And with a digital camera, of course, once I've invested in the camera, the only thing that was my cost, other costs other than that in the lens, was the 128 gigabyte SD card. And of course, when that fills up, I just erase it and start over. So here we're talking about an annual cost of $200,000 has been shrunk to about $29. And it's really amazing what digital cameras have done for this. And this is the reason why you see so many people getting into ICM photography now, because we can take 10, 20, 40, 50 exposures to get that one that we're looking for and not have to worry about the ones that we throw away. Now, there are several basic types of ICM, single exposure, multi-exposure in the camera, PEP Ventosa, and then what I do, which is called studio ICM. And I break that up into single exposure and multi-exposure, post-processing compositing, or C3. And that we'll get into in a minute. But first, I want to talk to you about the more traditional things. This is a photograph that I took a couple of years ago at a place called Bullington Gardens. It's just outside the town that I live in, and it was early in the fall, and the leaves had just changed color, and they were starting to drop down off of the trees. And I stood up on a stump, and I caught this late in the day, and that's why I got these real nice highlights and shadows coming off the tree trunks. And I started out down here at the bottom at f16, ISO of 100, and I think I had a neutral density filter on this at the setting of 4. And it was 9 stop, and I had it at the 4th stop or 5th stop, and started down here and just panned up slowly over that 1.5 second exposure. And this is what it did for me. It stretched out those trees. It gave me this real interesting base right here. And because of the blue background and the light that was coming through from where the leaves were thinning out up in the trees, it made it look like these leaves were raining down onto the scene. So that's the type of thing that you can typically get with a single exposure out in the field. And I encourage everybody, if they're just starting out on this, to practice with trees, because trees are really, really good subject matter for this, because you can follow the long parallel lines of these trees and get some really interesting results without a lot of undue effort. Then there is the multi-exposure in camera. People will set their cameras to do 2 exposures. one on top of the other, and then they'll move the camera horizontally for one and then vertically for the other. And this is really interesting how this works right here. And this was done by Robert Bechtel. He gave this to me to show tonight. And you can see here the vertical movement by the halos that we're getting in these trees out here. And that was a consequence of him moving this, panning this vertically for the first shot. But then for the second shot, he made a very slight movement from either the left to the right or right to left, I'm not sure. And as a consequence of that, it created all these really interesting cross hatches in the trees. And that was the dark blend mode, and that's a mode that's available on a lot of the digital cameras today. And you can see that also down here in the meadow and this vegetation as well. So that's a good example of the multi-exposure in the camera. Then there's one of my favorite techniques, and this is called the Pep Ventosa technique. Now, Lynn Fulton took this photograph, and this is really an interesting photograph. This tree looks like it's got thousands of lights on it, but it likely did not. There were some buildings back behind it. It looks like there was some sort of reflection pond or water or something. May have been some pavement that was wet in front of it. I don't know. I'll have to find out. But what happened here with the Pep Ventosa technique is you don't really move your camera, but you move your body and the body with the camera. So we're going to start out over here. Use the trunk of the tree or a place in the tree as our focal point. And we're going to make one shot. Then we're going to move over a little bit, stay equidistant on the tree, take a second shot, then move over, take a third shot, a fourth shot, a fifth shot, and so on and so forth. There were actually 20 shots involved in this photograph right here. And then we're going to blend them all together in Photoshop. And once we blend them, keep overlaying them on one another and changing the opacity, we end up with something like this. And it's a really interesting way if you've got a subject that's out in the middle of nowhere and there's not a lot around it to create something that looks really, really different. And I've done a little bit of this, and here's one that I did with infrared. This is at the Carl Sandburg National Park, which is just about a mile down the road from me. And I got my infrared camera out, started over here, and took 7 shots moving around it, keeping the focus right in here on the base of the tree. Once I got back into the studio, I blended them all together, matching up the base of the tree for each one, and as a consequence, ended up with these thousands of points of highlights on this tree. And it was just beginning to bloom this last year in the spring as I took this. So the tree itself, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot to it until we put these 7 photos together. And yeah, I made one mistake on this though, and I don't know which stop it was on, but you can see right here a line going through here, and I had to crop it to get rid of that. But I probably didn't stay equidistant from the tree. It would have been good to take a rangefinder with me to keep the equidistant from that tree. It looks like I moved out too far for one of the photographs, and as a consequence, one of the photographs was a little bit smaller than the rest. Then there is multi-exposure post-processing compositing, one of my favorite things to do. Now, this Moonlit Garden or Moonlight in the Garden that I did last year. Both of these, this composite was both taken from the same scene. And all I did with this was a couple of pieces of plants, a couple of pieces of, not branches, the twigs, and a few pine needles. And first I lit it from the backside with an LED diffusion lamp, and I lit it a little bit yellow. And then I did another couple of photographs, and you can see the similarities between them here. And this one I made white. And then I put them together, blended them together, and then turned the top one into its negative. And this is what came out as a process of just literally laying these two on top of one another and then inverting one of the images to its negative. Some really interesting stuff can come out of that. Now, I've been doing a lot of this recently, and here's gives you a good example of some of the images you can generate with that. The cockfight on the left was nothing but a couple of pieces of plastic bags that were backlit, and I had dropped two small pieces of red tissue paper into it. And that was what came out from that one. Enthalpy, it was another one, and there were two here that one was backlit and one was lit with natural light. And that when they were combined together, created these real brilliant reds and these real nice off-color yellows here on the artificial leaves were in here. And then cave art over here, that was literally done the same time that the cockfight was done, only I had taken the red pieces out and then overlaid the same image on top of itself. And I forget which mode that I blended this in, but doesn't that look like a bison running right here, a bird kind of coming down, and something else up here that's reminiscent of something that you'd see in a cave in Algeria that was made 3,000 years ago? And to give you an example of how this works, here's one that's really just a fun little image. It was an example of a throwaway image that I really brought to life with this blending mode, blending operation that I do. And this is called Kiss Me, You Fool. Backstory to that, but I'm not going to take the time to get into that right now. But this is what the original image looked like. The original image was certainly a throwaway. It was a root of a ragweed plant, a couple of pieces of cutouts from a piece of cardboard, and a couple of leaf parts. And there was not a whole heck of a lot to it. But I thought the arrangement was kind of neat, so I didn't want to just throw it away out of hand. So I went into Camera Raw and adjusted the light, the texture, the clarity, dehazed it. Then in Photoshop, did a color balance of the midtones to get rid of this orange cast, and then a little bit of hue and saturation adjustment and denoising and with topaz. And this is what I had right here. Looks a little bit better, but it still wasn't exactly what I was looking for. And remembering those images earlier that were composite images, I decided to just take this image and flip it upon itself and then layer it together one right over the other to get this final image right here. And once I did that and adjusted this with the luminosity mode, all of a sudden all these really interesting colors came out of it. So it's really something that if you get a throwaway image, which you'll get a lot of them with ICM, is just don't throw them away out of hand, because sometimes they can work really well when layered on top of another image. And for anybody that's wondering where this is at, this is the right-hand side of Photoshop right here. When you layer one image on top of one another, when you drag one image on top of the other, they will show up in the layers channel as being layered on top of one another. And you'll see this little thing right here that says normal. And that gives you, when you open it up, your different modes of layering these or blending these images with one another. And depending on which of these blending operations you use right here, you can blend this in multiple different ways. I just love this because I don't know how many of you were in the darkroom era where you tried blending images together, but sometimes that could take weeks to do, right? And when you got to the place where it was almost right and you had a flaw in it, then you had to throw it away and start all over. But the beautiful thing with Photoshop is, instead of having to start all over, you just go right back into the history and just back it up and go to a different blending mode. Now, the scenes for these images, although they look very complex and intricate, are not complex and intricate at all. What the scenes are is a spatial relationship, or is a dance between the spatial relationship of elements. And sometimes when I take a photograph, maybe this leaf over here is a couple millimeters too low or too high, and I'll move it by a couple millimeters and then take another photograph of it. And it's a combination of that spatial relationship, the lighting, be it from the side, the top, or underneath, and the camera movement that takes place, whether I'm moving in to out, or shaking it as I move from left to right, or turning it in a semicircle or whatever. And it's all of those that come together with the post-processing that brings us to our final image. And this image right here was generated literally from this right here. And it's nothing but a couple of artificial leaves on a ping pong ball and a ping pong ball that were blended together. And that's there's not really a lot to it. It's just a matter of perseverance with moving things around till you get them where you want. And I'll talk about this background and the impact that it had on it in just a minute. I think you can see it right there in this image. Now, the other thing to remember too, relative to this, is printing is very often the overlooked variable for success. It's if you're going to print your images out, sometimes they'll look really, really great in when they're on the computer, but then they don't necessarily look really so great when they're printed out. And one of the things that I've learned about printing is that very often it's necessary to adjust the colors and the color contrast and the lightness and the brightness a little bit. And the other big variable that I am just now getting into is paper. And if I've got a highly textured print, I'll put it on a highly textured paper to even accentuate that print even further. I call this the ventricular event. It's my heart and the aorta, and it's just kind of blowing up right there. Now, here's one that's a little more mainstream. I call this Tears of the Fallen. I did this one just last month, and it's nothing but a single leaf and a glass bead on a texture overlay. And what am I using for texture? Basically anything I can find that's got some texture in it. I was at a resale shop and I found an old canvas that some artist had not finished the painting on, and it was worn on one side. And I took maybe 50 photographs of that one area of that canvas just to get all of this effect right here. Now, what I'm doing when I'll use this as an overlay for some of them, but very often what I'm using is texture beneath the image and it will naturally blend with these image elements during camera movement. This is nothing more than spackling compound that I embedded into a piece of a burlap bag and then spray painted and then etched it. And you can see here, I was using, let's see, this piece over here with this, moving the camera in a very wide arc from right to left, or left to right, I'm sorry. And you can see how the texture from that background starts to blend with that camera movement. And from a very simple scene, we end up with something that's very intricate. You can take this to the extreme too if you want to. Here's one that I just took to the extreme just to see how much I could texturize something, and I call this the texture baby. That had actually 3 layers of texture over it. And then here's another one that was done right after I did the exploding heart. And these were the 3 images that I blended together. This image was done with a halo lens. And you can see here some elements of that, not plastic bag, but that burlap bag that had the spackling compound on it. I overlaid it with another image with a couple of leaves that was backlit in yellow to put those together so I could get a lot of contrast here between the two. And interestingly enough, when you mix these colors together and you go for a luminosity blend or a vivid light or a hard light blend, you end up getting a lot of aberrations in these colors here, so you can get a lot of really interesting things going on. And then this final one right here was just another texture that I had of a couple of leaves and a couple of other things were mixed together. And as a consequence, you end up with something that looks just like that. Now, big question. What makes C3 different from traditional ICM? Well, a couple of things we've already talked about. Control of the lighting, the materials and scene construction, simple is better. The lenses, additional camera movement opportunities as a consequence of the lenses we're using, the art of abstract pareidolias, and we talked about the dance before, but the camera movements, the scene arrangement, and the lighting. This one I call Arborist at Work. Doesn't this just look like an arborist up here with a pair of clippers clipping the tree? This scene was nothing more than a piece of masking tape, a piece of tree bark, and a little bit of a banana peel. Okay, so I mentioned a word there you may not be familiar with, pareidolia. Think of pareidolia like this. Our brains constantly try to impose uh, order to something that we see that we don't understand. If anybody here in the group has a dog, you'll know this. For the first 16 weeks of life, you want to expose that dog to as many different situations as you can, because after 16 weeks, if they see something they don't understand, it tends to drive them crazy, especially border collies. And so Border Collie doesn't have any reference point for something it sees. It becomes a nebulous stimulus that it can't relate to. But what our brains are constantly trying to do is they're trying to relate to something that we've seen before. So as a consequence of that, something like a bamboo leaf that has a little bit of tissue paper attached to it becomes a gull. And you can see he's got his beak sweeping down, little beady eye right here, and then of course his wings up here. And that's what a pareidolia is. So what we're going to cover: rules, camera selection, lenses and filters, camera settings, camera movements, and techniques that I do. First rule: if you're going to do ICM for your next meeting, first rules: don't get discouraged. I would challenge you to commit yourself to at least 500 shots of whatever you're going to try to photograph, because sometimes it takes that many. These were some of my very, very first ICM images. Didn't look like a heck of a lot. This was actually the, what do they call that? Lightning rod. A lightning rod on top of a gazebo late in the day in the middle of the lake. We have a gazebo in the middle of the lake down below our house. And this was the walkway leading out to that gazebo, and it was late in the day, so it's in darkness. This was the deck to my house, and from the bottom looking up. They weren't anything to write home about, but those were my first ICM images. I didn't give up. But that rule of not giving up, I want to diverge for just a minute, is true about many facets of photography. It's curiosity about what you and the camera can achieve. And one of the things I'm learning is cameras every day, they amaze me that if you don't think of them as a traditional camera, you can do some very interesting and different things with them. It's a story that's a rule of finding your own unique voice, what makes you an artist, and what makes you an artist that can tell stories about your art to other people, how it was made, what you were thinking, what you were feeling at the time. It's also true if you're getting into sales of any of your photography, uh, uh, because sales with photography is really hard. We started out this session with our leader here telling you that I was a pharmaceutical scientist. I also had a job that took me out in the field, and I had to work with a lot of sales representatives. And I can tell you, a lot of people think pharmaceutical sales is hard. It is not, compared to getting into exhibits and getting published. Uh, Photography is a lot harder. Rejection is the norm. And I typically get rejected about 8 to 9 times for every 10 things that I put my images into. But the thing is, don't give up, and eventually it will happen. This one right here is called Here Comes the Sun. This was one of my first photographs. It is nothing more than tissue paper sitting on a chair up against a window. And that was my original studio. And here's another image that's representative of all these concepts. It's one of my favorites. It's called tendinitis. The red was a piece of tissue. The surrounding was a couple of plastic bags, and this was the base of a glass vase. And the reason why I like this image so much is because a lot of people won't buy it. I did have a lady that bought it, and I use this as a story, and it's a good selling point right now, and it's why you want to have stories for your images if you're going to sell them. I tell people what happened with the first time I sold this image. This lady came into my exhibit. She grabbed this image off of my booth. She gave me her credit card and said, "I don't care what it costs, I want it." And so I'm running the credit card, and before I got the credit card approved, I said, "Thank you for buying tendinitis." She looked at me, she grabbed her credit card, gave it back to me, and stormed off. So I went and tracked her down. I thought I did something wrong. And she said, no, no, I didn't do anything wrong. This image is going to remind me of that knee surgery that went bad on me 4 months ago, now that I know the name of it. And I've used that story to sell this image quite a few times since then. And above all, just have fun with it. This is my moose walking his dog while holding a chicken. It is nothing more than a couple pieces of crushed oak leaves and a pine needle on a plastic bag that's backlit. Let me explain this. Moose's head, chest, shoulder of front leg coming down. Pine needle becomes a leash that's holding on to this dog, and there's his dog jowls and his ears. And then in his other arm, he's holding a flailing chicken. And people buy that one just because of the name of it. It's kind of funny. But anyhow, back to the story. 6 months and 10,000 shots after my first ICM attempts. And I would encourage you, if you're going out in the field, to find objects again like trees and trees in multiples, because they make good ICM images. These were 3 maples that were behind my house. And this was one of the last regular ICM images that I ever took. It was about the same time at Bulletin Gardens. It was about a 1.5 second exposure going from the bottom up. This gray area is the road behind my house right here. And they were in full color at that point in time. And I just took a couple of shots of this one. That one worked out real well. But the reason why I put that up there is because right at the end of that, I was walking back through to my workshop, which is below that deck that I showed you earlier. And I walked past a table that contained a couple of different plastic coated copper wires. And just literally by walking past it, I did a turn of the camera, a quick shot, didn't think much about it until I got back into the studio. And this is what came out of it. And I looked at that one, I said, geez, that wasn't very hard. Well, I ran back out to the studio, took 10 more shots of it, got nothing. Then I ran back out to the shop, took another 30 shots, got nothing. Then 100 shots, got nothing. And it wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I figured out how to do this. And if this image wouldn't have happened, I would have never gone down this road. This was the very first of that started what's been 5 years of experiments now on why this occurred. Why all this occurred up here. And so 50,000 shots later, I was doing things like this with my makeshift studio, which was like Here Comes the Sun, which I showed earlier. And I call this the peach. And it was nothing more than tissue paper on a blue plastic bag on a chair. And if you look very closely, you could see the rungs of the chair here. And this was lit with natural sunlight from the back. So I still did not have a studio at this point in time, but I really didn't like what was going on in the background and wanted to figure out how to control this. So I built myself a box. It was about 4 feet long, 3 feet tall, and 3 feet deep. And I covered it with cloth, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then all of a sudden, what I was getting was stuff like this. Now this was lit with a 3.5 watt lamp. If you're going to do this inside, you want to use a lamp that's a low wattage lamp. 3.5 watts is more than enough. And this was a collard green leaf. One collard green leaf was actually hung upside down, and then I turned the image upside down to present it here. But I bent half the leaf so the light, which was down here on the right-hand corner, was coming up straight back at the camera. And the other part was going through this leaf right here. And I learned a really interesting lesson with this. If you can shoot a scene and you can rotate a camera and keep that axis perfectly centered as you rotate it, that area in the center of that image is going to be retain its clarity qualities, while the blurring increases as you move out away from it. And I did not know a camera could do that if you were rotating it, but that was one of the learnings here, that I employ that quite a bit now in a lot of my photographs. The other one that occurred during that period when I was using that initial studio was bouncing a ball. This is one of the first ones that I included a glass sphere in. And I went in two directions on this. When I bounced across in a start, stop motion twice, then moved the camera quickly up and shook it very hard. And as a consequence of shaking the camera very hard and very rapidly, I ended up with these really nice hair-like structures here. This piece was unintended right here. It was one of the props that I used to hold this whole thing up in the studio because I wasn't backlighting yet. And this was a piece of the thread of a glass jar right here. And then we got to this, and that was one of the last ones I took in my old studio, which was called Perils Along the Road Less Traveled. I entered this in a contest, and I was trying to think of what I could do that would be different from everybody else, because, you know, you talk about the road less traveled, everybody's going to photograph an old road that is no longer being used and has a bunch of branches and weeds in the way and rocks in the way. But what I did was I got my plastic bags out, some newsprint, you can see a little bit of the newsprint there, parked a crystal ball on top of it to magnify parts of the scene underneath it. And I explained to the judges that what I had here was a road, and I was highlighting the perils along that road. And this one right here looks really weird. Looks like an eagle reading a newspaper to me. Anyhow, I won first place in that because they didn't. Because I really think they didn't know what to think about it. But what I learned along the way, and this is good for you for your coming shoot. Time and multiple shots are keys to success. You don't have to go as crazy as I do with it, but I take between 500 and 1,000 shots in the morning. Then in the evening, I'll post process, and you can go through these really quick because you'll know right away what you want to keep and what you don't. Lighting relative to subject placement is absolutely critical. It amazes me how just a little bit of change in the lighting and the white balance can cause such a dramatic change in the final image. And making incremental camera movement changes is really important. As you hone in on the final image that you want to produce, you don't want to be just making a very large motion this way and then a very large motion this way. Just try to repeat yourself as many times as you possibly can, keeping everything consistent, and that's the way to get a good image. The other thing I'm probably preaching to the choir here is don't rely on the camera's LCD screen, because you probably know that what looks great in an LCD screen on a camera very often looks just bad in a computer once you get into it on a large screen. And happy accidents occur. I embrace them and I think that they add to my vocal range with experimentation. Now, as we talked earlier, focus and scene simplicity are critical. And it's simply because a simpler scene will decrease distracting element collisions. Remember, you're moving the camera and you're painting a scene onto that sensor. And if you paint two different colors onto that sensor and they overlap one another, they're going to produce a third color. If you want to keep everything in focus, work within your camera's depth of field and stay within that depth of field, and don't move the camera in and out so that you're going in and out of focus. And let the scene elements determine how the camera will be moved. If it's trees, you want to make a movement up or down. If it's a waterway with an S curve in it, you'll probably want to make an S curve with your camera. So let the scene elements determine how that camera will be used. Now, in my work, shorter focal length lenses work better for me. I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit later. And experiment with different camera movement combinations. Don't do the same thing over and over and over again, because if you do that, you'll get the same over and over results. Now, if you wanted to talk about scene simplicity, here's a good example of this. This is a daffodil stem, a crepe myrtle bark, around which I wrapped a piece of blue tissue paper. Doesn't look like much at all. And I lit it with this little 3.5 watt lamp down here. And that's what came out of it. And I call that Blue Blossom. Here's an even simpler one. There's that piece of masking tape again. And this was from the same session that I used to make that arborist at work. And a small sliver of a banana peel. Okay, not a lot to that. My light's down here in the corner, and this is my old box right here. That's what came out of it. And that's called Gateway to the Jungle. So as far as cameras and equipment are concerned, any camera with a manual setting and an ability to expose at greater than 1 second will work. Cell phones will work, but you have to have a special app to do that, and it's called Camera FV5. It does what they call synthetic exposure, which is a totally different feel. And the ability to adjust the ISO settings very quickly is a plus when dealing with variable lighting situations. And that's why I like cameras like my Fuji here that have the wheels up on the top. That way I can hold the camera in position, adjust the wheel when I don't lose my position relative to the scene. And you'd be amazed how if you go from a start of a 45-degree angle to a start at a 50-degree angle, how much of a difference it makes in the photography that you're generating. And make sure the camera fits in your hand. The last thing you want to do is fight with the camera to start it and stop it in its motion. Now, I do believe that mirrorless is better in this type of photography, although I don't have any definitive proof of that. I did talk to Fuji about that, and my interest in that was by eliminating the prism and all the movement mechanism in a DSLR. I thought that it might last longer. So I talked to some representatives at Fuji, and they said that they test their cameras when they pull them off the line for 300,000 exposures. And if they don't last 300,000 exposures, then they think there's something wrong in their production process, and they go about finding it and fixing it. But with this X-T4, I had 1.5 million exposures on it before I stopped using it. Worked extremely well. So I really believe that mirrorless is better. As far as lenses go, nothing really fancy there. For my work, the lenses that I use are the wide angle lenses. If you're working out in the field, you can use a 50 millimeter lens or 100 up to 130 millimeters or whatever, because you're going to be back further away from your scene than you are relative to what I'm doing. The reason why I use these lenses twofold. First is at an f/16 with particularly my go-to lens is this Leia 10 millimeter cookie. I can go anywhere from about 5 inches to that scene out to 19 inches on that scene and stay within the depth of field. So everything will stay in focus. So now I've got the opportunity to move this way, which you wouldn't have if you were working out in the field with a longer focal length camera. So the shorter focal lengths are really good if you're working in the studio. And if one doesn't try out, go to a little bit longer one. It really amazes me how if I go from a 10 millimeter to a 12 to a 14, what a difference that makes in the final photograph. The other thing too is it allows me a little bit better control of what I call the wobble effect. And the wobble effect is, think of your ability to just hold the camera and move the camera only to within a certain uh, degree range of where you want it to be. If you're up close to that image, that wobble is going to create less of an effect on that final image than it is if you're back further away with a bigger lens, and that wobble creates a wider arc in when it's photographing that scene that you're looking at. And it also is a concern if you're doing something like this image right here. I call this eyeball in the wild right here. That is a ping pong ball, and I had a 8-ounce water glass that was fluted over my lens, and then pulled the lens and turned it to create this effect right here. Now, as a consequence of keeping my rotation centered on that ping pong ball, it stayed relatively sharp. A little less wobble means a sharper center. And these flutes in here were a consequence of the water glass staying stationary relative to the lens as I moved it. And that was what created that background, that right there. Now, it's also important when you're doing this and you go out in the field for your upcoming event is to set your cameras to manual. But remember that your manual isn't just this switch in front of the camera anymore. There's much more to it than that, particularly if you're using third-party lenses now. You want to turn the manual off everywhere. It seems like the manufacturers of cameras and lenses are putting gyroscopes in everything now. They put gyroscopes in the camera to balance, to cancel any movement that you may occur when you take a photograph. They put gyroscopes into the lenses to cancel any movement that you may make while you're taking the photograph. And that image stabilization will want to fight with the camera movement that you're trying to create. And if you don't turn that off, it's not going to work as well as if you do turn it off. And you want to initially set the ISO low and put the f-stop somewhere in the middle. And again, if you're going outside, make sure you've got a neutral density filter, because that gives you a lot more flexibility in the amount of exposure time that you can get without running into an overlighting situation. So after you take a few shots, experiment with different exposure times and speed of camera movement. Both of those variables will dramatically change the look and the feel of the final image, and evaluate for hot spots. It's something you just got to watch in this kind of photography, because the longer the exposure, the greater the likelihood of hot spots. And you want to make ISO adjustments in over and underexposed scenes, as opposed to going from wheels if you can, as opposed to going into the menu that's on your LCD screen. And pay attention to keeping the camera moving in a single plane of focus to improve the overall focus. Now we're running a little bit late here, so I'm going to go quickly through this next part of it and talk about my areas of focus in the studio. I am doing 4 basic areas: vegetation, wire, tissue and newsprint, and plastic bags and props to enhance these. This example, vegetation, I call this one Fred and Ginger. It was a simple sedgeweed that was growing in my garden I pulled out a couple years ago. Here's what you can get if you highlight a wire, and I'll show you how you do that in a minute. You can get some really interesting patterns. That was a single blue wire. And then newsprint, and I had not a glass face, but a glass jar right here, right in the middle of it, to accentuate, highlight the newsprint a little bit. Doesn't that just look like a person's face in there with a big eyeball, lips, and the nose? That's what I'm talking about with the pareidolias. And then plastic bags. This is called the art of frying donuts. I was in a Krispy Kreme one day and saw that and was inspired to do this. And this is nothing but a couple of plastic bags that were backlit, and I had placed a little bit of a candlestick holder on the end of it. My areas of focus, and of course the props. This is complex supernova right here with a bunch of my props involved in it. And this is what they look like. And I'm constantly looking for things to incorporate into these photographs to do this with. Then the types of movements, the rotational. If you keep it again the axis true, you'll get a center that is sharp. This is an old painting that came out of a resale shop that I photographed. Didn't buy the painting, but I did photograph it. And then as you move out away from that, things get a little bit more blurry. It doesn't just look like 2 people standing at the door waiting for somebody to come in. A couple of postcards, and I rotated that. And then here's one where I went vertical horizontal with a start, stop, start. So if you see me in the screen here, I'm going bing, 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 bing. So 4 stops along the way, and that was nothing more than a ping pong ball and a couple of pieces of tissue paper. There's another one which was just a couple of leaves and the ping pong ball and the glass beads. And you've seen this one before. And this one right here is a really interesting one. This was just a couple of pieces of string on a plastic bag, and I moved the camera in multiple directions to take that. And then there's a zoom, reverse zoom. I photographed my eye the day after I had had cataract surgery, and then surrounded it with plastic bags after I put the print on a piece of acetate, and then photographed it with a zoom out. And there's another one with a zoom out. And then again, with just shaking the camera very quickly, it will give you these fuzzy things right here, which are kind of neat if that's what you want to put into your photographs. And then there's one that I don't do too lot of, but if instead of focusing on the photograph, if you make a wide swath around the scene, you'll catch it and you'll create these really interesting mixtures that create things that look like this. And that was nothing more than a plastic bag which was wrapped around. You can see it right here, this ring light right here. Here's my moose. And to show you that nothing is off the table, here's one that's a really good one. Now, I was taking this photograph one day. I was 300 shots into it. It wasn't working. And then one of my best friends came in and helped me out with it. And I'll show you how that worked. Here he is. There he goes. And after 300 shots, a couple shots later, and I had it. And Ollie wrote a book. It's his little book, and he's my dog. And this is what we've created together. And that's probably the only one ever that was done with an assist by a dog. This is my studio now these days. It's nothing but a Home Depot portable studio, lights underneath it, and the switches for all the lights on the side. And here's one of my desk lamps that's a little too bright, so I put a diffuser around it. And to give you some sense of the depth that I'm working on, that's a typical photograph right there. And the three lights I use are the Govee hex lights, the Pulse light box, and I don't use the light box. I stripped the ring light out of it because I wanted a ring light, and the hit lights right here. And those are the three types of lights I use in this. Now you'll notice here with a regular desk lamp, a lot of times you get reflections that you don't want. My neighbor gave me one of these cones, and man, that worked perfectly. I laid it on top there. And here is what I'm talking about. Piece of wire and a little piece of tissue paper attached to it. And that's what came out the other end. And that's all the controls that are in the box. And the neat thing about the Govee hex lamps, the underlit lamps, is there's an app for these things. So you control every single aspect of these lights, and you can fit up to 20 of them together. And you can control each one individually to get them all to do exactly what you want to do. And they have infinite ability to manipulate them individually. So here's how I build a scene. Start out with the lights that I want. Lay a white plastic bag over it. Then toss in some newsprint and some of my props. I'll start to address these hot spots right up front. And then start to put some plastic bags around it, and then start to adjust everything with the Govee lights, the color, hue, intensity, the brightness, and so on and so forth. And when I finally get what I want, I will shoot the heck out of that, just like a fashion photographer would, so that I've got multiple images to choose from. I'll find one there that I really like. It looks like a good candidate, and I'll process it initially in Lightroom. If it doesn't work out right away in Lightroom, then I'll move it over to another photograph that's of that series. When I get one where I want it to be, then I'll move it into Photoshop, do my final post-processing in Photoshop with Camera Raw and Topaz to denoise and brightness and contrast in Photoshop. Now, there's another reason to make multiple photos. Every now and then you'll get one where you start and stop the camera and you don't have any backlash occurring in the camera. And when that occurs, you get something that's got really nice, sharply defined edges. And it results in something like this. I don't get a lot of these, but you do get them occasionally. And when they happen, they're very, very special. So that's another reason to make multiple photos. And then ice is what I'm doing right now, and just gives you some sense of what I'm doing with the ice photographs, and they create real interesting textures on the backgrounds. And sometimes turning these into monochrome makes a lot of sense. I call this drumming up a storm. And the ingredients for this were crinkled parchment paper, artificial plant parts, a plastic bag, a ragweed root, and 2 cups of water. Froze it overnight and then shot it. And this one right here is just a regular old ragweed root. And then a couple of plastic bags and a couple of these little glass pebbles, and I layered these on top of one another and flipped them to create what looks like some sort of a demon here. In a neural firestorm where I overlit the ring light so that the light was coming out the edges and then just shook it. And as a consequence of that, I get all these really interesting things coming out here. And then finally, wet magazine paper contouring. And that'll give you some really interesting images, and you can do those all days. And then we talked about negatives and inversions. I'll invert some of these things to negatives from time to time, and you never know what's going to come out of these, but sometimes it looks really interesting. Now, this is one right here that I did an inversion on, but I like this one over here. Doesn't this just look, if any of you have flown at night, doesn't this just look like nighttime over some Midwestern city with all the roads and the right angles in it? And those were pine needles right there. So that's basically it. If I can do this, you can too. And this is one of my shows last year. And I do about 6 of these a year, and we have a great time doing it and a great time sharing these stories with people that visit us. So that's my presentation for this evening. I want to thank you for your time. A couple of things to mention. If you want to take a look at my website, that's ddayicmart.com. Right there is the QR code. I'm also on Instagram at ddayicm. Now, my third book, the one that we mentioned earlier that has been out for about a year now, is called Studio ICM, and it's a guide to making abstract art with camera movement. It will talk about almost everything that I talked about here this evening. It's a real good manual if you want something just to refer to. I have one that's in the queue. I posted it to Amazon this evening. I have not hit the publish button yet. That's I want to make sure it's exactly right before I do that. So I want to go through it a couple more times. We've been working on it for the last 6 months. It's called The Emotional Residue of Dreams, and it talks about how dreams relate to what I make and what some of these images remind me of. And it's got, I think, about 80 different images in it, along with a lot of explanatory for the photographers for how this stuff is made. So if you're interested, take a look at it. So that's it for this evening, and I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks. Any
Dave.
questions from the room or from the people online?
David, do you ever use tripods at all, or?
No, never,
Never.
never. That would be. Although I've thought about it. I thought about using it, but I got a ball head that might work really, really well if I wanted to create something that had some real definitive movements in it that were that I could repeat from time to time. But I never have.
And on the blending modes, it sounds like you're using just a variety of different ones. Obviously, just having used a few of those things myself.
Yeah, most of them are simple overlays. Most of them are simple overlays, but every now and then I get one that really looks good in the luminosity or the dark blend mode, and I'll use that. But most of them are just simple overlays or soft light.
One of the questions I had was on the focal length of the lenses. You mentioned like you had like 10, 12, 23, I think were the ones you showed on just displayed there. Are those with the Micro Four Thirds Fuji camera, or is that?
It's an APC. I'll hold it up right here. Yeah, you can see. I think you can see it right there. Yeah, see, it's an APC.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
just trying to relate that to like, say, like a full frame or a crop sensor camera.
Yeah, it's an APC crop. Yeah, and if you're working outside, and if you guys are going outside to do this, that's not a real concern. And like I said, the reason why I use it is because it gives me a lot of control in the studio. That's not necessarily an issue when you're outside.
Yeah, I didn't have any other questions. A few of us, Dave, Bruce, and I were in here earlier in that, and before the presentation, we were talking about how our unintentional camera movement images are just not impressive. But yeah,
No, my experience is, I don't know. I go outside now. I'll take 100 shots to get one that I like. I'll take 1,000 shots to get maybe one that I want think about putting in my portfolio. And I'll take about 10,000 shots to actually put one in my portfolio.
Yeah, we were kind of trying to discuss a little what should be included in a ICM competition, and is panning considered, ICM? It certainly moves the camera. You kind of expanded our horizons here quite a bit with, not only moving the camera, but composites and things like that on top of it.
Oh, yeah.
I myself done a number of Pep Ventosa compositions with, around a tree with 42 pictures and blending modes, half a dozen different blending modes and different opacities. And the judge said, "Well, Dave, it looks like a tree." So I guess you're right. I need the right judge or the right.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I get a lot of is, what the heck am I looking at? But it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun explaining it to people because we've been so ingrained into thinking of the camera as just this stationary device that nobody thinks of it as being something that you can literally paint with.
Yeah, it's getting really cool.
Yeah, and if you really want to have some fun with it too, look up sometime how a digital camera actually works. And and I've done that. And you get it'll open up your mind to many new possibilities because that camera isn't reacting to light at all. It does not react to light at all. It's all about electromagnetic waves and the amplitude of electromagnetic waves. So when you change that ISO setting on that camera, when you reduce it, all you are doing is dampening the amplitude of the electromagnetic waves coming into that sensor. And the really interesting piece about that is when I am working in the studio, and I've got something over there right now that's just yellows and oranges. Every now and then, I'll get one that I'll move the camera in a certain way and the thing will come out totally blue. And I go, how the heck can that occur? But what's happening is you're moving it just right so that those electromagnetic waves that are coming off of the blue, coming off of the red, coming off the yellow are interacting it with one another in a way that is creating that electromagnetic wave that generates the blue. It's really fascinating to see how these cameras really work.
David, what do you do? Do you use your infrared much for your scenes? I know you had a few in there.
Yeah, I had a few. I find infrared is really, really tough. Uh, I don't know why. I don't know why, but I've been so absorbed for the last couple of years by this the studio thing. I don't even go outside anymore.
Any questions from the people at home? Nope, everybody says thank you. Well, David, really appreciate you taking the time, keeping you up too late here.
No, not at all. This
Yeah.
is actually a good time of the day for me because there are fewer distractions. Now, if
Okay.
you guys, hey, is Bruce still on there?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm here.
Would you do me a favor?
What's that?
When you have your final ICM images and you have it together, could you send me a couple of them so I could take a look at them?
Absolutely. We'll, we post our winning images up on our website, but I'll send you a link and you can take a look at them. And you're welcome to join us because we do our meetings via Zoom. I'll send you, you can look on the website as well and watch our competition night if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that because a lot of camera clubs shy away from this, and I'm glad you guys are taking it on.
Well, we try to do something that makes people do something outside of their norm. Otherwise, we would just see, the same pictures over and over and over again. So,
Now I can tell you something I just got. The Fuji Instax and the little Fuji camera. Okay, no big deal. But what I'm going to do with this is what they used to do with the old Polaroids. And I just can't wait to take my sodium bicarbonate and bleach to it. So I have no intention of making a regular photograph. I'm going to destroy it in the process, but it's going to be fun. Okay, guys, I gotta go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.
All right.